Hello! LVLS Weekly Time, episode 53. Ooh, we're doing it. We're doing this weekly thing. For this week's episode, I'm going to rank the Egret II Mini against the Astro City Mini to determine what is the ultimate miniature arcade cabinet. And I've got a couple pickups for you as well. I got two Marvel Legends figures, one for America Chavez from the Doctor Strange movie and Yelena Belova from Black Widow. I love both of these characters. I especially love Yelena, and I just really felt compelled to add them to my slowly growing Marvel collection. So I'll be unboxing those in a little bit. So first thing I want to evaluate between the two is the hardware itself. So the Astro City Mini has 37 games. The Egret II Mini has 40 by default. So in terms of quantity, the Egret II Mini wins. Both have the ability to plug into a TV set through HDMI. Both have the ability to have controllers attached to them. The nice thing is that, at least in terms of the Astro City Mini controller, is compatible with the Egret II. It's missing one button here, which is the actual menu button. But it is kind of an easier system to utilize than having to push both the buttons on the Astro City Mini version. Both have the ability to do save states. Both have the ability to do some tinkering with the options, although I think the Egret II Mini has a little bit more expandability on that front. One thing that the Egret has a huge advantage over the Astro City Mini is in the hardware itself. The Egret City Mini has this cool pop-out monitor. So right now it's in Taite mode, but you can rotate it to go the other way and then just pop it back in. So depending on the game, that's kind of a cool feature. Another nice thing about the Egret II Mini is this little SD card slot here. It allows more games to suddenly be used on this than the 40 that it initially came with. The Astro City Mini is not expandable at all. Instead, Sega chose to release a second one of these, which features mostly shoot-'em-up titles, and many that are licensed from other prominent developers beyond themselves. So the nice thing about Taito's choice here is that you don't have to buy a whole nother one of these. You would just buy an SD card that has 10 more games on it, perhaps more, and you'd have an expanded roster, which is great. But ultimately, while the Egret II Mini wins the hardware competition pretty handily, I would say, it ultimately comes down to the games themselves. And what I thought would be the best way to address this would be to talk about the games that I feel both of these systems are worth, and then talk about a few duds and some key omissions that really hurt the overall picture of what these can do, and I think that will ultimately reveal a better overall ranked between the two devices. So to start us off, let's start with the best game off of both. And for the Egret II Mini, it is unquestionably Elevator Action Returns, a game that I put in my top 15. Absolutely smashing action arcade game that revolutionizes the original arcade game from the early 1980s and really transforms it into one of the most transfixing, pure gameplay examples that I can personally think of. This is just an exquisitely designed, beautifully rendered, just incredible game all the way through. And the fact that I can now play it in a format where it is not altered or compromised by the emulation made me so happy. I eagerly played it the very first thing, and it made me delighted to play it and have the machine gun work, no slowdown, other elements that just didn't work properly working like they should in the original. The emulation on this is divine, honestly. But this is just a freaking-tastic video game that I'm so excited to be able to play in a modern sense, uncompromised. I'm curious to see how the Switch port of the Saturn game will act up, because I'm very curious to see how that will go. But Elevator Action Returns, easily the standout for me on the Egret II Mini. On the other hand, for the Astro City Mini, the premier title is Golden Axe Revenge of Death Adder, which is an absolutely smashing good time and one of the best beat-em-ups I've played. This is really something, because my experience with Golden Axe is typically negative. I don't care much for the original arcade game. I don't like any of the Genesis games. But here's Revenge of Death Adder coming in with just an incredible, amazing aesthetic that finally makes the fantasy vibes work for me. There's so much detail in the background. There's so much animation quality in this. Compelling characters to play as. I don't recommend playing Stern for this argument, but the other three are really unique in terms of beat 'em ups, and there's like more you can do in this game than you could in any other Golden Axe game, and the aesthetic is just incredible. The music is fantastic too. I really like it. And it just takes what had worked in the original Golden Axe games and takes it up to 11. And considering that I've always felt that the original Golden Axe games were around 5 or 6 or less, going up to 11 is such an awesome thing. So easily something that just delighted me to no end to be able to have a actual home version of this game that never got a console port before. Absolutely worth it just for this game, honestly. So from here, I'm just going to talk about a couple other really strong standouts for each system in terms of my personal tastes, as well as iconic games and some obscurities that you might not have heard of. So with the Egret II Mini, you can't ignore Space Invaders. That's honestly one of the biggest games in the arcade format ever. You can't ignore it. And another icon for Taito is, of course, Bubble Bobble. There's 3 Bubble Bobble games on here, the original and then 2 sequels. All of them are fantastic in their own ways. I think there's just something really awesome about the original Bubble Bobble that makes it stand above its prettier, more advanced sequels that are on here. It's just there's a simplicity to this gameplay that clicks really well, and it's just a charming classic of the 1980s with one of Zuntata's most memorable ditties included. So that's definitely one to keep an eye on if you get this. The last of the super well-known popular games is, of course, Puzzle Bobble 2X, aka Bust a Move Again. This one, at the very least, doesn't remove Bub and Bob from the proceedings, so that's kind of a nice feature, unlike the Taito Legends 2 version of this game. But this is one of Taito's most resounding successes in the 90s, and it's a compelling puzzle game that I like. It's not my favorite of the tossing stuff up type of puzzler, but it's very well done, and it's great that it's here. In terms of other games that I think are really strong on here, we've got some of the greatest shoot-'em-ups of all time, and starting with the spin-off from Darius, Metal Black. This is a visually stunning and just incredibly cool shoot-'em-up. I really enjoy Metal Black. I want to get into it more. It's not the most complex of Taito's shooters, but it is really well done, and it has some really cool background elements that come together that just make it super fun to see what they throw at you next, and probably one of Taito's stronger soundtracks for shoot-'em-ups, which says a lot, because Zuntata is really good at that. While on that note, Ray Force, one of the best vertical shoot-'em-ups I've ever played, with a very compelling lock-on laser mechanic that attacks stuff in the background. This is a visual feast to the eyes with another top-notch soundtrack, but this one in particular is one of Taito's high points in the genre, and they have delivered so many great shoot-'em-ups that does not come lightly. Finn's here. You've been hearing him through the whole video because he's desperate for attention, it seems. The last of the 3 super amazing shoot-'em-ups out of so many is Darius Gaiden, which is the only Darius game on here because it's the only one that would fit the screen. But it is among the best that Taito made in this series, and at the very least, I'm glad that there is a proper Darius featured on the Egret, and they picked one of the best. G Darius is my personal favorite, but Gaiden is pretty close. And the last of my personal faves is Kicks, which is such a tense game. You are this little circle right over here. I can't really point to it very well, but it's over in the corner there. And there's this big line that's moving around randomly and chaotically. That's the Kicks. And then there's little sentries that are wandering around the map. And your goal is to cut into the environment and take control of areas in the rectangle. And it's incredibly tense because you don't know when the Kicks is going to just decide to randomly move your way. And you can go for big points, that's what the brown areas are, or you can go for a quicker path that gives you less points. Huge risk-reward game, but one that I personally adore to pieces. I think it's such a compelling gameplay concept. Lunar Rescue is one of these obscure games that is a spin-off of sorts from Space Invaders, but I really thought it was fantastic. It takes the concept of shooting aliens and adds a lot of wrinkles to the overall gameplay, having to come down to the planet, land, rescue an astronaut, and then make your way back up while dodging an alien invasion. And then you just keep doing that and the difficulty rises. It really adds perfect amount of complexity to the original formula, and I really think it's fantastic. Speaking of obscurities you probably haven't heard of, Adventure Canoe is definitely one of the more interesting titles on the Egret II Mini because it's a bit of a shoot-'em-up of sorts, but at the same time it's like an obstacle dodging game, and it's oddly compelling. I actually quite enjoyed playing Adventure Canoe, and you can lose your oars, so you lose some of your capability to steer, so there's a nice little extra wrinkle to play well. Surprisingly entertaining game. Did not expect that. Another obscurity, I would say, is Kiki Kakai, which would eventually evolve into the Pocky and Rocky series under Natsume. This is actually, surprisingly enough, Taito's only arcade rendition of this franchise. They ported it to the Famicom and the TurboGrafx 16 PC engine, I guess I should say, but those were never localized. And it wasn't until the first Pocky and Rocky Under Natsume that we even saw this series. So in terms of seeing the roots of one of gaming's most fascinating cult classics, it's here. And the base game, while not as deep or as compelling or even two-player as the Super Nintendo games that this inspired, it's still a pretty engaging, fun little game to play. Next up on our obscurity list is Rymus, which is a very fun maze arcade game with a few shoot-'em-up elements. I love this game, honestly. I think that it's got a really good soundtrack. It has cutscenes, simple but responsive controls, and just a nice little gameplay hook that works really well. I quite like Rymus a lot. It's definitely one of the bigger surprises for me in terms of games that I got into on this thing. The last of the obscurities that I was actually pretty compelled by is Dan Kuga, which is the revision to Kaiser Knuckle, which is also on here. And it shouldn't be, because Kaiser Knuckle is not that good of a game. But Dan Kuga refines a lot of the mechanics and feels better to control. I used the exact same character in both, and I was able to pull off moves and feel like I had some semblance of getting through the game in Dan Kuga that I didn't in Kaiser Knuckle. This will not give Street Fighter II, or Mortal Kombat, or Fatal Fury, any of those games a run for their money, but with its destructible backgrounds and well-animated characters, it's worth checking out. It's definitely an interesting obscurity, and it was never released before. As for the games that I feel are the weakest on here, I gotta go against Clack and Pop. As adorable as it is, and as important as it is in terms of establishing Bubble Bobble in the future, it is one of the worst controlling games on this entire thing. Clack auto flips when he gets close to an edge, and you just can't really control where you're at because you're constantly going up and down in these narrow corridors, and you are throwing grenades that can kill you. So having finicky controls while you're trying to deal with enemies and trying to climb upwards is really frustrating. I don't like Clack and Pop, as much as it pains me to say that, because it's such an adorable game otherwise. Legend of Kage. I've never liked this game. It is such an awkward game. You can jump so high, but by holding up you cling to trees, and you jump with up, and you have to hold it to get the height. It just makes everything so stilted, because you just feel like you don't have forward progression. And I think the animation's a little awkward. I feel like it's one of those games that the enemies are just ruthless, and you're not really able to deal with it accordingly because you can't control well. I feel the same way about Capcom's Trojan. I just don't like the way the game feels. So I have to be mean to Legend of Kage. I am so sorry. Last but not least on my hate parade is Violence Fight. For a very brief while, this game actually was on my bottom 25. This is Taito's attempt at a Pit Fighter style game, and it was probably a year or two ahead of that game, but it reminds me so much of Pit Fighter, and I do not like Pit Fighter. It just lacks so much of what I enjoy out of both fighting games, out of beat 'em ups. The sprites are too big in some of the arenas because they aren't all with depth, so some of them are flat. It doesn't do enough with the barrels that you see here. The AI gets aggressively hard. It doesn't feel good to put moves together. It's just not it's not fun. It's not fun for me to play. So that concludes the Egret II Mini highlights, well-knowns, obscurities, and low points. Let's jump into the Astro City Mini. Let's start with probably one of the most well-known games on here, which is Virtua Fighter. It's the only 3D game featured on the Astro City Mini, but it's also one of the most important games in Sega's history because it established them as one of the pioneers of 3D. Much like the earlier Virtua Racing helped establish their dominance as arcade racing gods. Virtua Fighter set up the sequels, particularly Virtua Fighter 2, which became one of their biggest hits, as well as the spin-offs like Fighting Vipers, Last Bronx, Sonic the Fighters, and a whole bunch of home games like Fighters Mega Mix, Virtua Fighter Kids, and the reviled Virtua Fighter 2 for the Genesis. But in terms of importance, Virtua Fighter is way up there for Sega. It's a little disappointing that they decided to dabble into 3D with this one game and then they walked away from doing anything else, but it's understandable. Alright, in terms of icons, Space Harrier, one of the showpieces of the Superscalar technology, and an incredibly fun, unique way to play a shoot 'em up behind the back. One of Sega's most memorable 80s games, in my opinion. Has fantastic music too. This being here is an absolute must, and so I'm glad it's here. I can't go too far without mentioning Puyo Pop is definitely one of the more iconic games that are included on the Astro City Mini. I would like this a lot more than Columns. It's cute, but this is a franchise that's so important that Sega continues to own the rights to it despite the developer compile's eventual decline and bankruptcy. And you can still get Puyo Pop games made by them today. So this is one of two on the Astro City Mini, but 2 is definitely the better one. It's better animated, it's got nicer music. So yeah, definitely one of the icons on this thing. One of my favorites is Alien Storm, a nice little cross-up between a beat-em-up and a first-person shooter. And if you like beat-em-ups that are not too in-depth, but just have this really satisfying gameplay loop, and you like having things mix up the gameplay, this is your jam. I think Alien Storm is surprisingly one of Sega's best examples in the genre, and I didn't expect that going into it, but I kind of love this game. It's so kooky. But Thunder Force AC, what a superb shoot 'em up this is. I adore Thunder Force 4, and I think this might actually be the preferred way to play it, even over the Sega Ages version of this game, which is kind of weird. It felt better playing it on the Astro City Mini to me. I don't know why. But it's a beautiful looking game. It's got a really good soundtrack. There's just something about the Thunder Force setup that I really like, and I'm glad that it's here. I really am. Cotton. I'll show you 2 seconds of gameplay. That's about as long as I can show you. See what I mean? It is one of the few licensed games that Sega got on here, but it's one of the best shoot 'em ups on here, if not the best shoot 'em up on here. I think it's even better than Thunder Force AC. This is another early, I guess a medium age shoot 'em up that has had a really strong renaissance lately. But Cotton is a great feeling game with a lot of compelling visual quirks. It's got a solid soundtrack. I was really enjoying listening to the music when I was playing it, and it's just it's stunning. It's a stunning example of a horizontal shoot 'em up. Really, really good, and I'm glad that it's here. Alright, you want to talk about games that I really like on this thing? Quartet 2, which is the same game as Quartet. It's just they have the 2 there because it's only 2-player. But this is such a fantastic arcade side-scrolling shoot 'em up. You can equip gear to make you move faster, have a jetpack, change your weapon. You can play it with 2 people, and it's just, I think it's phenomenally good to play. I really like it. I really do. Definitely one of Sega's strongest efforts in the mid-80s, in my opinion. The Wonder Boy series is well represented on the Astro City Mini. There's 3 of them. My personal favorite is Wonder Boy 3 out of the 3 because it's kind of an interesting Contra-like game where it's a run and gun, but you can play it with 2 players and it has shoot 'em up elements in it as well. So it kind of keeps the pace varied. I think that this is a very fun, interesting game. I really like it. So I would say this is one of my standouts on the Astro City Mini for sure. Fantasy Zone is, I guess I could argue that it's a bit of an obscurity. It shouldn't be. It's actually should be among Sega's most well-regarded shoot 'em ups, but I feel like it doesn't get the knowledge or the acclaim that several others have done. But much like a Twin Bee and Parodius for Konami kind of launched the shoot 'em up subgenre, Fantasy Zone was one of the progenitors of it too. It's a gorgeous looking game for its age. It has really compelling gameplay mechanics. It's basically Defender, but with a lot more going on. And it's really adorable. So this is a really good example of Sega's shoot 'em up prowess in its early form already showing. Alright, if you want to talk about obscurities, here's Dark Edge. I bet you haven't even heard of this game. This is a wild, wild game that is not fun to play against the AI, but I have to imagine that playing against somebody else in person, this would be a hoot trying to learn how it works because it's an incredible looking game. And it's never been released on a home platform before, but it's just so strange. The perspective, the camera, it's swinging for the fences, and it nails so many things right, and yet it misses so much when you try to fight AI. I think this would be a wonderful experience with another person that was open to trying out a very experimental, wacky game. So yeah, this is definitely one of those most interesting obscurities on the Astro City Mini. One more on the obscurity train is Arabian Fight. This is a technical showpiece in terms of visual aesthetics. I mean, Sega was working hard on that one to try to make that like one of the most incredible looking games of the era in 1991. It's stunning watching all of the superscalar technology trying to make this very complicated game work. It doesn't control well. Much like with Dark Edge, it's swinging above its developers' capabilities in terms of making a good feeling game. But in terms of technical stunners, I mean, Arabian Fight is a marvel to look at. So I actually think it's a pretty cool inclusion that it's here, and definitely worth at least trying it out to see Sega at the top of their super scalar game, honestly. Alright, another game that I think is really interesting, and probably the last obscurity I'll have on this one, is Ninja Princess. This is an overhead shooter like Commando or Akari Warriors, but you're a ninja, Kinoichi, and I think this is a really good early example of the genre. Definitely up there with Commando and Akari Warriors, and similar titles as one of the best in this type of gameplay. You have to take it slow. If you go too fast, you'll get overwhelmed. But it controls well. It has features for you to dodge enemy attacks. You can power up your weapons. It's a compelling little game that I happen to like quite a bit. Alright, so I dumped on Golden Axe earlier, and I'm going to have to plop it at the bottom 3 here for me personally. I really do not like the way Golden Axe plays, especially in contrast to Revenge of Death Adder, which just is so much more fun to play. And I just don't like Golden Axe. I'm sorry. It just is clunky. It's dull looking. It doesn't compel me to want to play it and all. And the AI of the enemies is really cheap, and you don't have enough moves to deal with their cheapness. So I'm apologize to fans, but it is not my cup of tea. Columns. I despise columns. There's 2 of them on here. I forgot. There's actually 3 columns games on here. Ugh. I don't get this one. If I'm gonna play a drop-down game, it needs to be more compelling than this. I know this basically launched the match 3 style puzzler, but I've never liked it. The only time I like it is when it's Sega Swirl, which is not on this, and so I'm sorry if you like columns, if you like this style of gameplay. I do not. It does not jive with my brain. Alright, and the last game I'm going to just absolutely poo on is Alex Kidd The Lost Stars with Stella. And I thought that I didn't enjoy the Alex Kidd game on the Genesis. This is so much worse. You don't have a means of attack unless you pick up an item. You can't jump on enemies, you can't attack enemies unless you pick up an item. And the aesthetic isn't that compelling. I don't think it's like cutting edge or anything like that. I don't like the way that Alex looks, or I guess Stella in this case. Maybe it's more fun with 2 players, but my time with this was just almost pure misery. I just don't like this series. Alright, so I have picked 3 games from each company that I am surprised and hope that in the future will end up on one of these things. The good news about the Egret II Mini is that will actually happen. With Sega, it's kind of disappointing that these 3 games aren't there, but we'll get to them in a moment. So, first for Taito is Cleopatra Fortune, which is a very adorable, but for me at least, very compelling drop-down puzzle game. And I think it helps to have such a good soundtrack backing the action, but it's also very unique. And I just think it's very charming overall. That the way that the whole game works is really interesting, because you can see that that nothing's getting cleared here. But there you go. Once you trap in all of those sarcophagi, then it all clears out. It's a very different way of thinking about how to resolve this problem. You can also do traditional lines with the blocks, but the sarcophagi and the diamonds are kind of where it's at. And I think this is a very fascinating attempt to take that Tetris drop-down formula and do something very unique with it. And I think it's a fantastic game. Number 2 is Raystorm, the sequel to Ray Force. Now, I suspect this isn't on here because it's actually 3D. But I'm hoping that with expansions that we might get a few of the 3D games. And Raystorm is another spectacular example of Taito delivering one of the greatest shoot 'em ups of all time, following Rayforce doing basically the same thing. It may not be quite as pretty as Rayforce, since it's early 3D, but I still think that the gameplay hooks work really well. So I would be really excited to see this show up on an expansion. Last but not least is Time Gal. This is a Dragon's Lair-esque game with hand-drawn animation backing all the scenes, and if you don't do the action right, then our heroine here gets into comical death situations like Dirk the Daring did in Dragon's Lair, and you whisk yourself off to different time periods. Now, would this be the most compelling game to play? Probably not. Much like Dragon's Lair, it also, as you just saw, gets a little bit risque. It's an important game in Taito's legacy, and Raiko, if I remember right, is a very important character in Taito's history because of this game. So I think that it should be on the Egret II Mini at some point. Alright, if Sega were to make a third Astro City Mini, it needs to have the Super Scalar games. All three of my choices are Super Scalar games that are not here. So we have Super Hang-On, classic racing game that I skipped to a part where it's not actually showing the game. There we go. Sequel to Hang-On, which is also absent. I can understand to some extent because these games had specialized cabinets, but I think that they should have been on here. Hang-On or Super Hang-On. I went with Super Hang-On because it's a bit more visually impressive and the better known of the two. But this is a cool looking game that's fun to play, and it's Sega's early arcade racing history that's just not here. We'd have to get rid of all those licensed billboards, but we could do it. And then there's Outrun, which is another iconic Sega racing game that's not here. And it's inexplicable to me why Outrun, which is like, to me, synonymous with 80s Sega, is absent on the Astro City Mini outside of controls. I know that, again, had a special cabinet. I think they could have made it work. It just feels odd not having it here. My last choice for the Astro City Mini is Afterburner II, which is the sequel to Afterburner, which both of these aren't here. Again, specialized cabinets. But this is another iconic Sega 80s game that pushed the Super Scalar technology and was visually stunning. This was why Sega was such an arcade powerhouse. Just look at how cool this game looks. And it's just not here. It's not on here. Both are great. The Egret II Mini is just a more fully featured machine in terms of games, in terms of hardware, in terms of contents. I just think it's the better decision. Of course, I love Taito more than Sega, so that's just the nature of things. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Next week, I've actually already recorded it. And the reason why I'm not adding that footage here is because it would make this episode extremely long, and the way that both of them were shot is going to be a bit of a bear to edit. So I'm trying to make my mental health, which is very important to me, take priority. So next week we will talk about games that I own that I thought were the most expensive ones, and then I'll find out if I was right or not. And I can tell you in advance, having done this exercise already, I'm pretty good at it. So that one will be fun. So we will see you in a week's time. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful 7 days until we meet again